Well, I'm excited to have our conversation today. This is the first time I've done a conversation on deconstruction. And deconstruction is one of those things that for I think a lot of people just feels destructive. And I've brought in a guest with us today who wrote a book that I think is going to be a blessing, and it's going to help people I think to rethink things, not just in terms of philosophically or conceptually, but biblically. And this author just put out a book I'm really excited about sharing. The title of her book is called Knock at the Sky, Seeking God in Genesis After Losing Faith in the Bible. And Sarah Bessey actually wrote the foreword, and here's what she says about Knock at the Sky. She says, Knock at the Sky isn't apologetics for progressives. It's a much needed half step over from the tightly managed paths of your past into the wildflowers off the trail. There is room to breathe here. Liz Charlotte Grant is an award-winning essayist whose work has been published in The Revealer, Sojourners, Brevity, Christian Century, Christianity Today, Hippocampus, and elsewhere. She also writes The Empathy List, a popular newsletter that has been nominated for a Webby 2 years running, and she lives in Colorado. Liz, welcome to the channel, my sister.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to this kind of point that you're at right now.
Yeah. I grew up white American evangelical. So in a very particular kind of Bill Hybels bubble. So I don't know if anybody knows Bill Hybels, but his church is Willow Creek out in the Chicago area. My church growing up was very much a sort of little kind of mirror of that church. So, we were kind of aiming for that. So my upbringing just in general was very, I think, limited by that. And also I had kind of more of a sense of I didn't grow up fundamentalist, for example. So I had kind of a sense of what the world was like, but I was still in youth group cutting up my CDs, my secular CDs. Did anybody do that?
Oh, yeah.
I remember cutting up, my CDs were now 25 or something. It's like I'm Sam Goody, elder millennial here. And so I had a pretty classic youth group, CCM kind of upbringing. And then ended up at a evangelical college, studied creative writing. That is my expertise. It is writing. It is not theology. And so, but I will say, I always had this deep love for theology and this desire to walk with other people as they encountered God. So I volunteered in youth groups. I was a church intern a couple of times, different places. That was always kind of on my mind. What does it look like to be a person who is sharing Christ with others, in a relational way? I mean, at the time I read, Messy Spirituality by Mike Yaconelli. And I don't know if anybody has read it here, but it's very much, kind of relational evangelism. It's what does it look like to walk alongside people? And that was kind of going all through kind of the youth ministry culture at the time, and people were kind of picking up this book and changing how they related to young people. And I was really taken by this. So maybe no surprise, I actually ended up in therapy my last semester of college. Being such a relational human, I had a lot of pain and hurt, and my family of origin is messy. And I was telling Kyle before this started, that was the first time I was really pastored, was sitting across from a therapist who was really willing to encounter me and be present with me through all my feelings and all my, I had a lot of big teenage feelings.
Oh, yeah.
Still have lots of feelings, but maybe a little bit less of the kind of roller coaster. Yeah. I hope. I don't know. You have to talk to my husband about that and see what he says. But anyway, I think it was a really in some ways it was a really beautiful upbringing in Christianity, and it was also a little bit devoid of some of the kind of meat that I was really hungering for. And that kind of hunger for that sort of relationship for me with other Christians, it was hard to find people who were kind of willing to go to a certain depth, to be really honest about what was in our hearts and minds. Um, and that led me toward kind of Acts 29 and a like more Calvinist Reformed theology in my
Wow.
20s. And um, but unfortunately, I'm a very strong female, and so being a strong female in those spaces is a challenge.
Mm, mm.
So definitely experienced some of my own kind of church hurt and spiritual abuse, and um kind of in recovery from family abuse, and just went through a lot, and because of that my faith changed a lot.
Okay, what you've just shared, I would say relates to many of the folks who are listening. They have gone through a process wherein they have gone through maybe different conversions, different ways of thinking about God, a lot of introspection, a lot of kind of this like, well, this is what I'm supposed to think. This is what I've taught. And if I believe or think differently, then maybe I'm wrong. And maybe I'm not strong enough to believe so. And just all of these invisible dilemmas. I do think it's interesting briefly that you took a trip to Calvinism for a moment. Is there something, what drew you there?
You know what? I think it was just the depth. I mean, I don't think I actually I wasn't very interested in Calvin. I was interested in the seriousness with which those Acts 29 dudes took their faith. So it was like so intellectual. It was exegetical. People are, you're preaching through the text verse by verse. I was very interested in all of that. And that in part is because I am a literary person. Like I love literature. I want to get into the words and the details. And so I think I just always related to the Bible on that level and wanted my pastors to relate on that level. And I think there was a little bit more space in that particular way of thinking. It's not really a denomination, but there are denominations that kind of hold that.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't really interested in those denominations because I've always been a strong woman. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
been a challenge. But Acts 29 seemed like a kind of a more contemporary version of that maybe I could join. It did not end up that way.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine. And the other thing that I think before we kind of get into the meat of the book is like I get for a lot of people they're like, well, I want, let's say a theologian or something. I think the value of kind of someone who doesn't have that formalized training, to me, that actually comes with a new credibility. And the reason why is because in this sort of post-Christendom context, people, the idea of expertise has been kind of a bit dissolved. I mean, like there are things, these sort of ways of thinking about people's credibility that have changed. And I think for a lot of people, it's that kind of experiential, but also kind of that, well, are you able to think outside of the box? People trust that more than someone who is just committed to a rigid sort of, when I think of Calvinism or Reformed theology, not to get too much in that, it's system, like this deep system. But in terms of like how your personal faith journey has informed the writing of the book, like your book is something that I think is going to speak to a lot of people. Let's get into like your book. Like what led you to write it?
Yeah. Yeah. I, I mentioned kind of my faith shifting.
Yeah.
Um, I think that happened at a time when a lot of other people were also experiencing faith shifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, that was kind of around the 2016 election, and that was some drama.
Yeah.
And so everybody, I think a lot of people my age were going, is this it? Is this kind of there's some kind of incoherence I'm seeing between the things that my elders have said they believed and kind of how they are choosing to live their lives. And so around that time, there was a lot of scandals that were coming up in the evangelical church. And there was this kind of movement of people who were saying, okay, deconstruction, this is what this is. And for them, it was like, it's a whole range of things. Like it could be faithful people saying, I have questions. I want my life to be coherent, like the way that I live and believe to be coherent with the Bible, with Jesus. It was also deconversions, right? So there's like a whole huge range of people in that category. And I think this book that I wrote very much came from this desire to reapproach the scriptures after a sort of faith change, after a faith shift. And in particular, I was interested in the stories in Genesis because it is this sort of primordial beginnings book in the book of the Bible. In the library that we know as the Bible. I was fascinated to see these kind of first encounters that humans had with divinity. And I didn't approach it from the sense of I'm going to come down on the right answer or I'm going to tell people what it means. My goal was very much, what does it look like to explore? What does it look like to approach with a vision of a creative writer, not as a seminarian necessarily, even though I do some heavy exegetical lifting, but as a storyteller. When I approach as a storyteller, what does this book have for me, have for us? So that was kind of my goal, was like, I wanted to create a beautiful work of art from this work of art, and kind of continue to expand our imaginations about what it can mean and be for us.
So can we start with the best definition for evangelical, and then what does it mean to be this sort of post-evangelical?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I say evangelical, I mean sort of the cultural milieu of evangelicalism. So for me, that's very much like the CCM and the youth group and the big pastors and the mega churches. And, it's a very American version in my brain. It's very much this like white American evangelical. And some of that also is kind of this like evangelical complex, industrial complex. So that's a little bit what I have in my mind. I understand that there's a broad range of what that can mean to other people. I think the way that it impacted my life was very much these kind of cultural influences and these products and these people, right? So very much it was less about like the heady, theologies that we agree on, and more about the experience of being a part of one of these churches. So that's probably what I mean. Other people have different definitions, and I am not the final word on that. When I talk about post-evangelical, I'm very much referring to an experiential reality where I actually no longer go to an evangelical church. I'm now in the main line, which I believed was like completely not Christian when I was growing up evangelical. I was like, yes. You are not a Christian if you are mainline, if you are Catholic. There were kind of all sorts of, and I don't even know if we would have said it directly in my church upbringing, but we thought, that's not born again. That's not true Christian. Right. And so I feel like one of the things that has been so humbling for me in my life is to realize, I was probably wrong about that. I made a lot of assumptions about who I thought these people were without really knowing anything about them as individuals or even as an institution. And so, I feel like when your faith changes, you eat a lot of humble pie and go, I was probably wrong.
Oh, you do. I have felt that. I've had an apology tour.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because when we're so zealous, I mean, a lot of times when you have zeal, you feel like you have everything you need. It's like, what am I missing? I have the truth. I have the gospel. And then we become so competitive that tribism it just has downstream effects that really end up hurting Christendom as a whole. And so part of what you're describing really kind of gets to that. Okay, so let's get into some meat, because I think some people are like, this is a great conversation, but I would like to understand a little bit more of the meat of what you're getting at. You're not necessarily providing things from this super technical perspective that someone would expect, let's say, from a theologian. However, you are thinking about it in terms of like the creative writing process. You're injecting that in, which I think is very helpful. Now, how does your literary, reading of Genesis differ from a theologian's exegetical process?
Well, let me give you an example. Okay. So Genesis 1, I became really interested in writing about Genesis because I became really obsessed with the idea of God's voice and God's throat. Because, of course, God speaks the world into existence, but God has no body. So, how does God make sound? Like, how there, normally you need like a body, a container to even make sound and to project and to have somebody hear you. Instead, God at the beginning of the world, who is containerless, no body, no throat, no lips, no teeth, no spit, God speaks anyway, right? So even there, we have kind of God defying physics to create the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
But as I kind of went through the story of God speaking, one of the things that kind of kept coming up for me was this idea of first contact. Like God is the one who makes first contact with us. And, first contact is this term that we use for aliens or different creatures, right? Like it's like a sci-fi term, making first contact with a new species. And I started to think about like maybe it actually helps us to think about God as more of an alien life form than we have done. So I started to see these connections between God's speech and whale song. Like these aliens on our own planet who speak without the same containers that we do, but their speech is real speech. I mean, it kind of changes their environment. They actually, whale song is wild because they like sing the same songs even when they're in different oceans. So it's kind of like they're like listening to radio stations. And anyway, so they're whale radio stations.
I didn't know. That's cool.
I know it's wild. It's wild, but nobody knows for sure kind of why whales sing. They know that like they sing without opening their mouths, right? The air actually goes through different like containers and like in their bodies, different organs doing different things, and that's how they sing. But it's not like how we sing, right? So anyway, when I was searching for this kind of metaphor for like what other things on our planet speak, but speak in a totally different way than we do. I started to just think about these whales. And so I think one of the things that was really important to me was to create some new metaphors, like especially for folks who have been harmed by stories in the Bible, especially stories in Genesis. Genesis has been such a potent weapon of the culture wars. And so for me, it was important to say, what does it look like to be a gentle guide back through these stories? And part of that was just being very curious and telling other stories alongside. So I'd like tell stories about the man who first recorded whale song. I tell stories about the discovery of dark matter. It's very much like a book about origins. Like, where do we come from? Where are we going? And including even the origin of the Bible itself. So all of these stories are kind of mixed in alongside this kind of tracing through the Genesis story from the beginning of the world when God speaks the cosmos into existence without a throat, through Jacob wrestling in the dirt with the angel or God or whoever in Genesis 32. So I tried to stick with kind of the most evocative passages and really to sort of illuminate the text with other story as well.
You get into where did the Bible come from? How is it formed? Who is it for? Why does it matter? And the reason why I want to ask this is because my desire is not just for the person who believes. My desire is to speak to the dilemma that people have who either want to believe or really just can't bring themselves to believe for whatever reason. In other words, I think some people feel like if I actually come to the table, I can't ask questions. I just have to accept whatever someone who's reading the Bible is telling me. I can't think critically. I can't think imaginatively. I can't really bring my person into it, it's all accepting. I can't bring anything. And I feel like for the person who is really struggling with this God thing, they're probably suspicious. Like, this is kind of a little bit too human for me as a story. This is too fallible. I got one shot to live my life, and I'm going to base it off of this human tradition where people tell you to don't do things. And it's, I think for people who are struggling to come in the faith, they have some really basic questions about the Bible that a lot of times I think in churches, either we're not comfortable with, or we don't know how to drop down to the level and really kind of get on someone else's terms. And that creates a divide. That's not okay. It's not okay to not connect with people. That's what Jesus did, and that's what he expects. And so I think for some of us who come from these theological systems, it's kind of like we're starting to lose that bottom generation is kind of falling out because they are asking these questions. They aren't just accepting. They're thinking critically, and they don't want to be shamed for thinking differently. So I say all this to say, let's get to this idea of, okay, where did the Bible come from? How was it formed? And so on.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say those questions are so important. So, for anybody who has heard that they're not allowed to bring their intelligence to the Bible or, into church, I just want to say, I don't think that that's something that Jesus endorses, if I can be so bold. I believe that if God has made us with minds, there's a reason. If God has made us creative, if God has made us curious, I think God did it on purpose. So I don't think you need to shut that off and not think critically just because you walk into a door of a church. Okay. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is I have found such inspiration in finding all of these people who have encountered God in the Bible, but also who have kind of been a part of bringing this story to us. So one of the things that's been important to me is realizing this is an ancient work of ancestral wisdom, if nothing else. The Bible is our ancestors' spiritual encounters with the supernatural, with something kind of beyond what they could understand. And it has come to us because other ancestors after them decided to continue copying this book over and over by hand so that we could have these stories. So at the very least, I have started to think of this book as a masterwork of literature, kind of in the vein of Beowulf or the Odyssey, or some of these kind of ancient works of literature that we continue to revere as a culture and continue to learn from. I think the Bible is unique in many ways, but one of the things that has been fascinating to me is how psychologically true it remains. A lot of these kind of mythic stories, like, from Homer or Beowulf or some of these things, they tend to kind of have this really dreamy quality. And the Bible has that sometimes. But I think what's been fascinating is to kind of really get close to some of these characters and say, they are psychologically complex. They have so many complex parts to them. This is true with the Odyssey as well, I think. But I think some of these ancient stories, the reason they continue to persist is because they have something very true to tell us. I also, the fact of so many ancestors passing this work down, to me, that means they contributed in some way. This wasn't just a God possessed somebody, possessed the gospel writer, and then they're kind of, scribbling with God as ghost kind of moving their hand. I don't think that's true to what we have. And in fact, we have tens of thousands of manuscripts that make up our Bible. And so, we kind of have to wrestle with what amount of God actually lives in these pages and how do we quantify that? Because I think that's a question that probably none of us can answer for sure. Christians believe the Bible to be inspired. What inspiration means exactly, I don't know if we're going to be able to nail that down, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a mystery. And so I find that struggle to figure out kind of what amount of God is in the text and what amount of humanity and kind of how did these things come together. I found that wrestling really interesting and compelling. And I see a lot of room there to be creative as we engage it as well. Um, I don't think the Bible itself is fundamentalist about this idea about inspiration. In fact, it's not clear. And I think that actually is an invitation to us.
So could you just for a moment step away and just sort of, play it down just for the average person, inspired and inerrant?
Yeah, so inspired is kind of this idea that God had some hand in writing this book. And and there's various kind of ways that people will talk about kind of it's like a spectrum. So some people will say that God wrote the Bible. Other people will say, well, humans wrote it. God inspired, like kind of like a muse. God kind of gave them ideas or words or phrases or whatever, Some people, when they say that, they mean that God interacted with the characters of the Bible, but maybe didn't actually get into the words, which is fascinating. So there's a whole range in human history, like Christian history, sorry, as we examine like what it means, like what level of God actually exists in the Bible. I find that really interesting. Some people find that very threatening and scary because we actually want the certainty of knowing that we can trust this book completely, right? Like these are God's words. So if we mess with them, we're messing with God. There is a certainty there, right? That allows us to know for sure that we're on stable ground. Mm-hmm. That's where this idea of inerrancy comes from too. So biblical inerrancy is this idea that the Bible is perfect and without error. Part of that also means like it was kind of like hermetically sealed through all of the centuries. You like put it in a airtight box and nobody touched it from the 4,000 years ago when it was somebody first penned the first part of one book through today. Right. So that's kind of part of that idea. I think I understand where that comes from. I do think it becomes challenging as you get more and more familiar with this text to see the text as without error, because there are cosmological mistakes sometimes, right? There are scientific things that are not right. There are, like, ultimately, this is an ancient book. And so we kind of have to like weigh what level of God, again, is in this book, and like what kind of trust do we place in it? What kind of, how do we read and interpret it? And ultimately, kind of what I've come to is that reading the Bible has always been an exercise in discernment. Mm-hmm. It has always been about, in a community of people, reading this book, listening to different perspectives, inviting more people to the table to learn from each other. And both the experts, the scholars who are experts, who are linguists and translators and manuscript critics, the ones who went out into the desert to find these manuscripts. There's a story I tell in my book about that. Like we need all of those people. We need the theologians. We need the seminarians, but then we also need the people on the edges, because some of those people wrote the Bible too, right? And God speaks to them too. And so there's this kind of whole range of people that we need. We need all of these voices to even try to understand this book of voices, right? Who are all talking about God. And I think one of the things that's been so meaningful to me in these recent years as my faith has shifted is this idea that, like, the Bible is not God. And that means that God is more than the Bible. God is beyond containment in human words. And so we get to encounter God in the Bible, but God isn't the Bible. Like we get to encounter God in this world in ways that are even outside of the Bible sometimes, right? So it's a challenge to figure out how to kind of pin these things down, but I think that challenge is worth taking on.
It is, Liz. You're saying so much that has so many layers. I think that what I hear you saying to some degree is that we have a relationship through the Bible, not necessarily with the Bible. And it's easy to have a relationship with the Bible versus having a relationship through the Bible.
Right.
That's number one, is that it is about relationship more than technicality. And God's bottom line point is that I'm going to send, Yahweh's ultimate human voice, which is Jesus Christ in human form. He becomes the embodiment of everything we're trying to get to. And it's like the biggest message that God's trying to send, he uses his son to send it. So let's not get too technical. Now, and I'm not saying technicality doesn't have its place, but he supersedes all of our ability to kind of make it this thing that we can control. The other thing is something that I really borrow from Peter Enns that I think is stretches people, which is this idea that it's the kind of incarnate analogy, which is that the Bible is 100% human and 100% God, just like his son. Jesus is 100% God and he's 100% human. No one's arguing that. Well, so is the word of God. And so and this is for the people who are listening, who are like, I want to push in the chips on Jesus, but I'm like, I don't know about this whole Bible thing. Can I trust it? It's like, okay, yeah, it is a human story, and that's okay. Because God is not just looking for his sort of sovereignty, going back to Calvinism, he's looking for partnership.
Right.
The Bible is kind of an emblem of partnership, of goodwill, like that. I mean, so this idea of partnership, does that kind of resonate with kind of the way that you've conceived of the Bible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this idea of like collaboration.
Yeah.
I think one phrase that kind of kept coming to mind as I was studying these early parts of Genesis is that God desires a conversation partner. Like God wants a partner in conversation, in working, in living. You just kind of get this sense about this deity this divine person who is so excited to know us and just continues to show up even though we act terrible over and over. But like God keeps speaking. God is the first one to make contact every time. And that is such a fascinating way to conceive of God. I think being able to make space to say, even, if we're thinking about just how does Jesus treat humans, right? Like, what does Jesus think about humans? What does God think about humanity? Like, God is kind of obsessed with us. God like keeps coming over and over, keeps wanting to know what we have to say. And so this idea of kind of 100% God, 100% human made for the Bible, I think is very true. And in fact, God would be very excited about that. Like, it wouldn't be a threat to God to have us be a partner because God has kind of set the whole thing up that way, right?
Now, what are some tools that you suggest for people who are hoping to return to the Bible after faith transitions?
I think giving yourself space is sometimes very reasonable, especially. So just to say that first, because so many of us have experienced the Bible more as a weapon than as a gift of mercy, or as a relationship. It has been used against us.
Yeah.
And in that case, I do think it's really important for us to have some space and rest, to encounter God in other ways. Because again, God is not the Bible. God is beyond the Bible, right? I think for those who are wanting to re-encounter, I think it has helped me to engage with guides, like to have other guides and to, like I said, to invite more voices to the table. So for me, that looked like, okay, I'm familiar with what the dead white guys wrote about God and about the Bible. Not that they're not important or right, or, they have good things to say, but I needed a broader picture, a broader perspective of who God was and what the Bible was. So I started reading all sorts of other theologians, ones that you might not read in kind of a general theology class. but it might be kind of the specialist class off on the side of the seminary, right? So or maybe they have been, sidelined because certain theologians don't like each other or certain traditions don't like each other, right?
Yes.
And so just like where I had these kind of false ideas about what the mainline was, I had some false ideas about other types of theology. So I had to relearn from these other voices and say, okay, what does a disabled theologian think about this? How do they read the text differently? What is a womanist, like a Black female theologian, how does she read the text? How do women read these texts? What do they bring to the story? How do people who are non-white around the world, right? Like who are not American, who are not wealthy, how do they read this text? A lot of my conceptions about what I thought the Bible was saying really were just sort of cultural lenses after all. It was, I'm a white lady, upper middle class white lady in the United States of America. And the views that I have are a product of that culture too. And so being willing to say, I don't have the final word on who God is. And thank goodness, thank goodness I don't have the final word. I need my brothers and sisters to speak and tell me who God is from their perspective, because the truth is, I believe that there is an objective truth, but I think it's a challenge to get there without all the information, right? So we need the information. We need to understand from other people's perspectives to even get to that objective. So anyway, I think for me, it was very much being intentional to bring in other voices, ones that I had been unfamiliar with, and to be open and curious about what made them think the way that they did. That gave me a really different perspective on the scriptures. And then I think reading in community with other people in my actual life, being able to say, hey, I'm learning this from this person. What do you think about that? And having these conversations, that was fascinating. So yeah, opening up the conversation more broadly.
I love what you're talking about, because you're actually talking about some important steps that get missed partly because of our hyper individualistic culture. So one of the threats that I would want to sort of delineate for a moment is that deconstruction itself is not the harm. It's when you combine it with individualism, which is a high price, because then you're basically siloing yourself and you're not getting the benefit of community. So one of the things that I don't want people to miss, Liz, about what you were saying is the power of community, and then finding, building an ecosystem of people who you can sort of glean things from. Because I think what some people are doing in their sort of like posture of there are no more experts is there's almost an exaltation of like my truth, versus you just mentioned something that I think kind of slipped under the radar, that you do believe in objective truth. And in our sort of postmodern Gen Z world, truth has kind of been, I wouldn't say eradicated, but it's been majorly deprioritized. And right. I think that for many of us who are deconstructing, I think that then we're grouped into this sort of colander or this sort of basket of, well, you don't even believe in truth anymore. That's not
right.
what you're saying. There's little things that you're saying here that mean a lot.
So true. Yeah. I mean, I think it does feel challenging though, to say both I believe in objective truth and I believe that we can't get there without everybody's perspective. I mean, that's really challenging, right? So to say that me individually, I might not be able to find it by myself.
That being said, the way that Americanism has affected the way we think about Christianity, there's something to have a conversation around in that. What are some things that, do you get to some of that in your book?
I would say I'm very gentle in this book. Okay. So this book is very much, so the answer is yes, and you might not pick it up.
Okay. That's okay. That's
but I think part of it is, okay. I think part of it is just telling different stories. Like for me, that has been so huge in understanding that I'm not the only one. Like my perspective doesn't necessarily win because it's not actually a competitive race, right? Like to be at the top. And I would say one of the things that Americanism values is that competition, right? That's like a capitalistic ideal. The strongest wins. And that's very Darwinian, honestly. It's like, the survival of the fittest. But that's not a biblical idea. And I think being able to tell stories and share the perspectives of people who are not the people at the top, who are not the ones who have quote unquote won, I think that is transformative and has the power to transform us.
Okay, what is gained and lost when religion consolidates power and influence to institutionalize? So there's two parts to this, which is that part. And then the second one is, how do you personally reckon with the American Christian institution?
This question for me came up when I hit the story of Abraham in Genesis, because so much about that story, Abraham, we can point back to and say he is the founder of faith, and in fact of three faiths, right? Yeah. So three separate religions that share kind of a root, but still, we can kind of go back to that. And I think one of the things that was challenging for me as I read through the story of Abraham again and re-encountered that story was that he is a very flawed founder. In fact, I would say from my perspective, I believe he was abusive to the enslaved woman in his house, Hagar. And maybe to his wife too. So there's a challenge there. And for me, I turned to some kind of ancient commentators to try to understand. So I turned to Chrysostom and, some of the early church fathers and the rabbis. And I was trying to understand, how did they make sense of the story of Abraham and Hagar and Sarah when Sarah gave her enslaved woman, her handmaiden, to Abraham to be a surrogate mother for a child. So I was trying to make sense of this passage, which is very hard to understand, and returning to these kind of ancient commentators to say, what did they see in this? Like, what am I missing? And what I found in their text was that they were sort of covering over the sin. It felt like to me, like it sounded sort of like a crisis management team, like at a mega church, where it was like, he wasn't really bad. He never lusted after Hagar. He never forced, this to happen. It was really Sarah's fault, his wife, because she couldn't have children. Maybe if she hadn't been infertile, she was the one who suggested it, by the way. They're kind of going through all this. And I struggled so much with that for lots of reasons, but I thought it's so clear that the Holy Family has done the wrong thing here. So Sarah and Abraham, by not trusting God, they then abused the slave girl and her eventual son, Abraham's son. And it was so clear to me. But I think one of the things I realized is they had this kind of idea in their head of what the institution meant and what the story meant. Like this man had to be a type of Christ. He had to be exactly perfect. Otherwise, maybe it meant that Christ wasn't perfect. And I just saw all those echoes of institution, right? The echoes that say we kind of have to protect the founder, even if he's messed up, and just not tell the truth about what has actually happened. And that's where a lot of the questions about institution came up for me, where I was going, what level of kind of protection, repentance, forgiveness, accountability, all these kind of concepts get all mixed up together when we're talking about institutions and figuring out, what's our relationship to power, really.
hold on real quick. The way you just brought in Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar was profound. That, and then relating that to institution and sort of this founder syndrome that we can, fall into. Whoa, I've never heard that take before.
I mean, it surprised me, but it stopped me in my tracks because I got to a point in the writing this book. This was probably halfway through writing this book. And I was like, I don't know if I can keep going because I cannot stand this man at the center of the story. Abraham, who has abused the enslaved woman in his household. Sarah and Abraham end up throwing Hagar out 2 separate times. The first time she actually runs away, she's pregnant. And that's when God first encounters her and she gives God the name El Elroy, the God who sees me. The second time, Abraham and Sarah actually throw her out and she is convinced they're going to die in the desert, her and her son. She puts her son down under a bush and walks away because she does not want to watch as he dies. And that's when God shows them a well, which in the desert is wealth and safety and power. And they built a society from that because of the gift of God. But I think one of the things that she became a major character in this book because I think it's very easy to push her aside. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things institutions are not good at is allowing a diversity of voices, a diversity of perspectives. Institutions thrive when there's one narrative and one leader, preferably a charismatic leader, who's a good fundraiser. And I think, the call that we see in the scriptures is that the healthiest church is a church that embraces every member as having a vital role, right? I struggle to find a way that you can have a healthy institution like that. One that is, equitable, one that prioritizes the relational models. That's very challenging and it's not very capitalistic. I think there's challenges there.
There's a lot that you've shared. And I think for some people, they're kind of just triggered. Some people are triggered on the side where you're at. And I kind of am there too, which is that the church is never to side with power.
Yeah.
It's a big deal.
Yeah.
We are not to side with power. And that's really kind of at the heart of the gospel too. But regardless, on this side is kind of the disenfranchised. And then on this side, there's a different type of disenfranchised, which would be and again, I can understand both because I really spend time sitting in the both and, which is, well, I'm a male and I'm not toxic. I don't believe in the machismo. I'm not trying to do anything but lead my home, be the head of my home in the way that Christ is the head of the church and the way I've been called to by Paul. I have the biblical mandate to be this leader. And then for those people to not just tune out when you're talking, now you're talking, you're talking about Abraham. Whoa, come on, man. What? This is not okay. And so people,
I know,
disenfranchised, and then these people do. And
well, first of all, I understand that complexity. I'm white. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that is complex. It just is. And being a white lady, everybody, I feel like, being online, everyone's a second away from calling me a Karen, right? Which is probably reasonable in some cases, right? Well, just in case. That's always in the back of my head though, wanting to be aware of that. Okay. I would say, so I just relate to both kind of the marginalized groups and these groups in power is what I'm trying to say. And so I think there is a reality there. I mean, there is loss when a group in power realizes that you have too much power, that what you have is actually not healthy and good for you or for other people. I mean, as a white lady, I can say that definitively from the perspective of white people. It is not healthy and good for us that white supremacy is the norm. Not to mention for other people, right? So I think the fact is any sort of redistribution of power or voice is always going to feel threatening, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. In fact, I think it's very good. So, I mean, it's been I've been so grateful for the voices of, in particular, BIPOC voices who have been able to really gently tell me the truth about these things, whether it's me personally in an interpersonal relationship or it is online, getting to know people and their generosity and sharing their experiences. I mean, I just think the reality is if we believe in the sacredness of every human, that God has made every single human in God's image, then that means we actually have to make space. We have to lengthen and widen the table. And there is just no way around it. That is the gospel message, that God sets the table for all of us. So it's a hard word, and I know it. I know it's a hard word. I feel it in my own self. But it doesn't mean that it's not something that should transform the church. And so I think if our institutions do not have space for that, then they are not gospel institutions.
I love it.
Kyle is like, you say it, then I don't have to say it.
There we go. No, I think that people who've written and taken the time to process, and I'm a first-time author, and so I'm writing a book right now with my co-author.
Good for you.
It's amazing to take the time.
Yeah.
After you really engage in the writing process, and you really have to sit with things, there's a credibility that I just kind of have skipped over in the past. Now that I'm going through that process, I can respect the work that you're doing differently, and you're not just coming up with these sort of ancillary talking points, but on this digital farmstead I think that we're all on, it's important to understand that people are still putting the time in to write, to process. There's all this information going on, and so discernment, I love that you said that earlier, is an important piece. As we get ready to end and all of that, do you have another thought for your next book?
Oh,
yeah.
This probably doesn't surprise you based on where we just went, but I want to write about the prophets next.
Oh, yummy.
Because I'm nothing if not ambitious. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. This interview's been fire. Thank you. I'm serious. I was sitting there thinking about the questions and stuff as we get ready to bring it in. I really think that you have taken the time to process, not just write. Like, there's a gift there, and I look forward to actually reading it. My wife and I look forward to. She's getting really interested in deep discipleship, and
love it.
And my wife wants to go, and learn from a Bible school, and so
do it.
But this type of thing is a great. I think in a lot of ways, I think it's a great step for people who want to get deeper. And I think that you're one of those voices now. You're one of those voices you're talking about. Awesome job, my sister.
Oh, thank you, Kyle. That's really special. Thank you.
Yeah, you are. Well, I want to say to you what I say to all my guests, that we are with you and God is for you. Liz, thank you. Thank you for blessing us and taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much. It was just a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, if you have been with us through this entire interview, I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank you for taking the time. I am really looking forward to this year, getting back, interviewing. I've taken the last year off and I feel fresh. I feel like I have new concepts. I feel smoother. I'm ready. I hope you are too, and I will see you next time.